What's the best measure of learning? If you just said grades, then we may need to talk because an A can mean you understand the material or that you understand the system. But if grades aren't the measure, then what is? Is it the light bulb moment? Is it a student teaching their roommate? Authentic assessment? Or even training your puppy? Today we're pulling back the gradebook curtain to find out. Welcome back to the What and Who of EDU, where we bring you insights from the leading educators, researchers, and innovators who are shaping the future of teaching and learning. On our podcast, we share real-world classroom strategies that help you create a more impactful and effective learning environment. I'm your host, Marissa Bluestone, and today we've got 10 ways instructors measure learning beyond grades. And if you'd like to learn more about our featured educators, their bios are there for you in the show notes. We all know that GPAs look great on paper. They're neat, they're tidy, but they can't tell you how a student handles the messy, real-world stuff, like solving problems or adapting on the fly. In our first tip, Dr. Kristen Monroe, an assistant professor of chemistry at Landmark College, says that's why she looks beyond the transcript and doesn't judge the story by the score.
I once read something where they essentially said that it's so key for students with disabilities to do the job that they're looking to do in the future, because then they demonstrate to future employers that they can, in fact, do the job. And so giving students opportunities for internships, research, applied projects, whatever it is really key. And I think it's also really important to recognize that GPA doesn't tell the whole story. A student that gets a B in a class could know so much more about content than a student that gets an A. But the student that earned that B and really spent more time and just learned more, that's the student that I want to have working for me, not necessarily the student that gets A's every time. So I think ultimately providing students with those experiential learning opportunities is important, but also as a culture, we need to work to look beyond GPA as the only metric to determine whether or not a student or an employee is the right fit.
She's looking for students who've done the work, wrestled with the ideas, and grown through it. And that B student who shows up and keeps pushing, they may walk away with a far deeper understanding than the A student who just skated through. So if GPAs can't tell the whole story, how can we tell if students really understand the material? Dr. Daniel Look, the Charles A. Dana Professor of Mathematics at St. Lawrence University, wants to look beyond what's being memorized. So he ditches some of the traditional assessments in favor of something messier, but more meaningful: conversation. Because the students who fight his alternative assessment, they might have mastered school itself, not the materials.
I would argue that our academic achievement system is pretty flawed. When I do my authentic assessments, the students who reject it the most tend to be the 4.0 students. And that's because they've got that system down. They know what to do with the system. And this quote unquote standard system of grading isn't necessarily a good metric of what they actually know. It's how well they can play the game of exams and quizzes and writing papers or whatever. So to me, a conversation is the pinnacle. It's just onerous and not always possible. You have a 60-person, 100-person class. You can't necessarily do this. But if you have a 20 or 15 or 10-person class, that's a way that I can really get what they understand. Let's just have a conversation about it. But that, unless you force it, make it part of the class, like you have to do this once a semester or whatever, that then only catches a certain number of students. So that one's really hard.
He may be onto something here. Conversations reveal what multiple choice never can, but that's not the only way to dig deeper into learning.
But things I spot in the wild, I'm like, you've got this, is the transference of knowledge, right? If I see them like, oh, this problem is very similar to this last problem, it's not written the same way, but the key concepts are the same. That's when I know you've got it at a deeper level and at a level that I want you to have it at, where you can transfer and apply it to other things. And so that's when I would say that if I spot that, I know I've got it. And trying to get them to do that is good, but that can be hard. That can be really hard. It just takes so much time to really know how much a student knows.
Dr. Look's point is simple. The test shows you what stuck last night. A conversation shows you what's going to stick for life. Students can't get away with reciting an equation when you ask them why doubling the radius of a pizza doesn't just double the size. It makes way more pizza. Of course, conversations don't only happen in office hours. In Dr. Star Sinclair's classes, learning doesn't stay in the classroom, and her students have been known to pass the knowledge to their roommates, their moms, and occasionally even their golden retriever. In our third tip, the assistant professor of psychology at Florida Gulf Coast University explains why turning students into teachers makes learning sticky.
We can measure learning by looking at how students transfer that learning, whether it's they transfer it to someone else, whether they are transferring skills or things they've learned to beyond the classroom to other aspects of, whether it's another class, whether it's something in their life, whether it's something on their job. That to me, honestly, is the best measure of learning. Is because, academic achievement, okay, yes, a grade on a test or an assignment or whatever, that's all well and good. But I am not teaching and I'm not an educator because I just want students to be able to get A's on tests, right? Or write a really great paper. I'm an educator because I want them to take something from this process that we've engaged in together and use it, right? Have it be of some use to them in some way, shape, or form, whether it's academically, personally, professionally, or whatever. I love hearing when students are like, oh, remember that thing we talked about in class? I went home and showed my roommates that, or I went home and I was talking about this with my mom over the weekend. I love that. I love that they're talking about how learning works and conditioning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning. And as students, oh, I got a new puppy. And I actually was trying to use the operant conditioning principle to train it to go outside or to not make a mess. And to me is okay, when students are able to show that they can see the connection from the content in the classroom to anywhere else outside of it, that gets me super hyped and super excited because that's exactly what it should be, right? To me, transferable skills, transferable knowledge, anything where they can demonstrate that they can transfer it and apply it somewhere else, that to me is a great measure of learning.
That's not a test score. That's transformation. And for our bingo bonus, fellow psychology instructor Mary Gurley at Gaston College takes it one step further. She doesn't just hope for transfer, she asks about it, and then she measures it.
I do that in the form in my classes of asking student-specific questions on a survey that I provide to them and collect. And it's just asking other questions like, did you talk to people in your family about this class? Did this come up at your part-time job? Whatever the situation is, I think just trying to find out how their normal lives were affected.
Star and Mary remind us that when learning leaves the classroom, students don't just absorb knowledge, they share it. They become a small army of peer educators who can't help but teach others what they've learned. If Dan says traditional grading rewards the best gamers, Dr. Mike May says, okay then, let's just change the game. The professor of mathematics at St. Louis University knows students are chasing points, whether we like it or not. He redesigns the system so that learning becomes the fastest way to win and gives us our fourth tip.
Lots of ways of measuring it, none that go in the system, I really think. And part of it is I described there are two games going on. The instructor's game is trying to get the student to learn math. The student's game is trying to earn points. And therefore, with that axiom system, part of the instructor's job is to arrange the points so that the optimal way of picking up points is also a good way to learn, to pick up learning. That we're training students by handing out gumdrops, handing out points. And you want to make it so that I ask prerequisite quizzes, for example, that there's a one question, multiple select question that I set up. I've done it with several learning systems. That the most effective way of getting the points is to actually sit down and read the book. And there are points attached that you are to have read the book in advance. And when students come to office hours, I want to see their written notes and how have they prepared themselves.
Students are gonna chase the cheese. So May redesigns the maze. The cheese is still there. It's just hiding under a pile of calculus. And you've got to find X to solve for it. Growth over grades might make a great ad campaign. But Jennifer Duncan, Associate Professor of English at Georgia State University's Perimeter College, isn't here for the clever copy. She's here for something tougher and deeper, which gives us our fifth tip, reminding students that a final grade is a measure of a moment, not a measure of a person.
I don't want to say growth over grades because I'm pretty sure that's in a commercial for a product that I've recently seen. But I think that our students, especially in college, and because I have a high schooler, I think I can accurately speak to this. They are pushed so hard to make sure they get a certain grade or that they are in a certain level of the class that they are often not challenged to think and to try something new and to look at not where they are, but where they were when they started and where they get there when they at the end. I think that my challenge as an instructor is to figure out how to create a syllabus and course policies and grading policies that measure their growth, not just by a grade. I'm not saying that everything has to be labor-based grading. I don't fully understand all of those concepts, and those are hard for me sometimes to apply. But if you say to a student that I'm going to judge you on whether or not you can do this thing instead of whether or not you learned something along the process, then we are saying that our class is like a check the box class. So instead, I try to make sure I always affirm students that ask questions. I always reach out to students who are struggling and say things like, I see you're struggling. Here's how you can address this. And one of the things I very often do for my students who do not succeed grade-wise in the class is send an email to say, hey, I want you to know that I know that this grade is not necessarily a reflection of who you are as a person. It's a reflection of what you were able to do this semester in this time period in this course. It does not mean that this is an indicator of your future success or your ability or your intelligence. I need you to know that because I need you to be challenged, but I also need you to know that this is not the end of something. This is a chance to reassess your goals, reassess your strategies, reassess what you're going to do. So that end of semester letter to the student who's not going to pass your class is probably actually more important than the end of the semester that says, yeah, you got an A, I'm so happy for you. I think encouraging those students and saying that a grade is a measure of what you accomplish on an assignment. It is not a measure of who you are.
She's challenging the entire system that tells students to chase perfection while punishing growth. Her goal isn't to rescue them from failure. It's to reframe it. Because in Duncan's world, a grade is just a timestamp, and there's still plenty of tape left to roll. If learning were gardening, grades would only measure the flowers. That's why Dr. Charlotte Desarrouges, assistant professor in the Department of Biology at York University, pays attention to the roots. Tip 6 is to watch the trajectory.
Grades and academic achievement are important, but are not the only measure of success. I feel there are a couple of ways by which we can measure learning beyond academic achievements. More granularly, skills development is one avenue. Evaluating which skills and knowledge retain. This is especially visible when teaching students who then continue on, for instance, as teaching assistants for the same course. You can identify the strengths, what's stuck, along with the potential gaps too. At York University, I've had the privilege to teach students first entering introductory biology, then continuing on in second year biochemistry, second year cell biology. And now I've just recently taught them while they were working towards their third year molecular biology course. It's really amazing to have a chance to watch them grow. And we can't also minimize the transferable skills that have also been developed too. Case in point, I recall a student who was quite shy in first year biology, sharing with me she was a first gen student, bravely attended her first in-person student hour session and didn't know anybody. Over the courses, the student shared that she was more and more confident with biology. Student hours really helped her to connect with her peers. She ended up finding her own peer study group. Together, they tackled, for instance, biochemistry problems. And now she's volunteering in the hospital, hoping to bring some of her experiences in her new role. Besides skills development, broadly, I really enjoy hearing about where our students end up. I've had former honors thesis students continue on with grad school or professional school, or even enter the workforce following the completion of their degree.
From shy and unsure to hospital volunteer, from intro bio to molecular biology, she's tracking what stuck, what grew, and what carried students forward. Because in Charlotte's world, success doesn't show up in a grade. It shows up years later when your former student sends you an email from grad school just to say hi. Okay, we've talked a lot about how traditional grades can miss what really matters. But what if the problem isn't just what we grade? Dr. Ryan Herzog, Associate Professor of Economics and Faculty Fellow at Gonzaga University, says it might be time to stop looking for academic achievement in academic packaging. Tip 7 is to have students show what they know, or in other words, make it make sense.
I think we need to get creative at this, right? Because academic achievements, if we're thinking about papers and we're thinking about some of the other traditional methods we use to assess academic achievement, it's getting harder and harder to assess this achievement. And so I think this is where we need to be a little bit more creative in letting the students have more freedom in showing us how they've learned the material, right? I have a colleague that's having students do TikTok, Instagram reels, right? To display, like, how would you create a TikTok that explains an economic concept to someone that hasn't taken economics? And I have another colleague that used to have a paper and said, you know what, you can do any type of final assessment. It can be a paper if you want, you can do a video. She's had students write children's books. So we just need to figure out ways in which we can assess academic achievement without it necessarily being academic. And to emphasize, you do well on a test. Okay, so you've shown this academic ability, but are you able to take these and create things beyond just scoring well on an exam?
So he's not anti-assessment. He just knows it shouldn't all look the same. If you can explain opportunity cost in a podcast episode, create a TikTok about inflation, or apply supply and demand to why concert tickets cost a fortune, that'll count. And after creativity comes utility. Betsy Langness, psychology professor and department head at Jefferson Community and Technical College, reminds us that the best lessons aren't souvenirs, they're tools. She believes that learning happens when students can walk away with knowledge that helps them take control of their own lives. That's why our 8th tip is simple. Build a toolbox, not just the theory.
One of the most interesting things about psychology is students think that psychology is just learning all about all of the psychological issues and diagnoses and all of that, where really we can show them how this applies to the real world, like advertising and classical and operant conditioning. Does it make you hungry when you see a food commercial on television? does it make you want to go out and buy this car because everybody's fancy and laughing and going to a nice dinner and all of this? So, really, that real world application where they can take that knowledge and apply it to real world scenarios, I think is really interesting. And that's one of the questions I ask them. I get engineering students and business students, and they're probably like, why am I taking psychology? Here's how you can apply it. And then just the critical thinking, just how to create a new habit, how to have less stress in your life, how to change your eating habits, whatever it might be, just being able to create these multiple solutions to your problem, becoming a problem solver for yourself. A lot of the students that I work with, I work at a community and technical college, they feel like a lot is put upon them, like they have no control over their environment and what happens to them. And so I'm showing them you can be a problem solver. You can figure this out. You can analyze your situation and change it if that's what you want to do. So hopefully by learning some of these broad topics, they can figure out how to change some of their behavior, their thinking strategies, and some of their habits.
Her students don't walk away saying, I learned about stress. They say, I started sleeping better, or eating better, or challenging a pattern that's been holding them back for years. This isn't a theory, it's psych class, life skills edition. We've talked about transfer, projects, and life skills, but Dr. Amy Goodman, senior lecturer in the mathematics department at Baylor University, reminds us that some learning is invisible to everyone but the learner themselves. In fact, the most meaningful measure of learning can be hidden between the numbers and the notes.
In my opinion, the whole point of education is to facilitate learning. And with learning being the creating, the building, the integrating of new knowledge. And if you're not in an academic setting, learning is really not always measured by achievement. It can be measured in lots of small ways that manifest in your everyday interaction with the world. In fact, sometimes what you've learned may not even be observable outside of yourself. So when we talk about measuring learning in academia, we really are talking about whether or not the learner has constructed and integrated the knowledge that you've tried to impart to them so that they can use it to complete other tasks, whether it's in your class or in other class or in their life. And the best way to, in my sense, to measure that or to get a sense of it is literally to talk to them. If it were possible for us to just bring students into our office individually and have a conversation about, tell me about how to take a derivative. What rules do you need? Under what circumstances? What conditions? When will it work? When will it not work? They could just dialogue with you and tell you what they know. You can give them a few example problems on a whiteboard and say, show me how to do this procedure, and let them model that for you. But just in the conversation you're having and the abilities they're able to show you one-on-one, you could probably get a pretty decent assessment of that student's abilities on a topic in like maybe 20 minutes. But I think the problem with that kind of assessment is scale, that it's just not going to work for even just in one classroom of 20 students. If you spent 20 minutes per student, that'd be 400 minutes, which is just under 7 hours with no breaks. And that's for one class. You would never do anything except have conversations in your office with students all day long, and you wouldn't even have time to teach. So when we're talking about measuring learning, besides academic achievement, I really hope that higher education begins to move forward a model where we are having a much lower teacher to student ratio so that we are able to have learning be more personal for our students.
Her ideal assessment is a 20-minute whiteboard conversation where she asks her students to walk her through how they made a derivative. She's aiming for the kind of moment where students explain what makes the math. Because you won't always see learning in a score, but if you ask the right questions, you might just hear it. While Dr. Goodman's listening for the hidden learning, our final voice says sometimes the proof doesn't show up until years later. Dr. Derek Harmon, who teaches anatomy at the Ohio State University College of Medicine, says that's the whole point. Because when you're treating patients, remembering anatomy isn't just about learning, it's about lives.
I think the benefit of working at the level in the health professional programs that I get to do is we can see these learners transition from students to the practitioners. So once they transition into the actual clinical practice, I get emails sometimes, I get letters from them sometimes and saying how comfortable they feel with their anatomical knowledge compared to some of their peers, like when they got to residency, right? I felt like I was so well equipped for anatomy compared to some of my peers that came from other institutions. And I felt like I was ready to directly utilize that knowledge I had to now treat patients. And so that tells me that academic achievement has met beyond any standardized test they might take. This is where it's actually the most important. They're actually making patients' lives better. That is the best achievement of measurement, I think, in my mind.
The metric isn't a number or a letter. It's a moment that arrives unannounced, sometimes months or years later, which brings us to today's second bingo bonus. Dr. Margaret Holloway, assistant professor of English and composition coordinator at Clark Atlanta University, has seen that moment firsthand. Because the same student who scraped by, well, somewhere between then and now, they found their voice, and now they're asking for help on their grad school application letter.
I think that sometimes it can show up in a number of ways. It can show up in a student who I taught 4 years ago who's graduating in the spring, and one student told me, Dr. Holloway, if it wasn't for you, I would not have been going to missionary school. He's going to be a preacher. And he said, I just did not realize how much writing and thinking I had to do for that. So it shows up in some of the most random ways for me. Students who are applying to grad school or going, getting an internship. Dr. Holloway, can you look at my application letter? And I know this was a student who struggled in my class, and to see how they are able to articulate on paper, how they're able to articulate to other professors, that is a measure of success in itself. And I've seen it from students who I've taught 4 or 5 years ago to students I taught last semester who are doing a number of things now.
It's like the difference between teaching someone to parallel park in an empty lot versus getting a text years later that says they just nailed a spot in downtown Manhattan during rush hour. The bottom line is, whether a doctor, a preacher, or something else entirely, the students are ready when it mattered. We've heard it all: the timestamp grades, the cheese under calculus, the invisible map, and the pizza that quadruples when you double the radius. Together, they remind us that the best measures of learning don't fit neatly in a gradebook. They sometimes spill into conversations, into workplaces, and sometimes even the dog park. If this episode got you thinking about authentic assessment, or reminded you of that one student who is now teaching in the area they struggled with when they were in your class, pass it along to a colleague, leave us a review, and while you're at it, check out our featured educators. Go follow them, thank them, and definitely steal their best ideas. Leave us a voicemail with your own tips on how you measure learning at 512-765-4688. And you might just hear yourself on a future episode. Until next time, I'm Marissa Bluestone, and this is the What and Who of EDU.